I almost didn't know how to start this one, because what I'm about to walk you through isn't a prediction. It's not a scenario. It already happened. This week. Last week. In a sequence of events so compressed and so consequential that I genuinely had to sit back and think about whether people fully grasp what just shifted. The Munich Security Conference, the annual gathering that has been the heartbeat of Western alliance politics since 1963, closed 3 days ago with a question floating through its corridors that nobody had ever asked before. Will this be the last one? Not as a prediction, as a recognition that something had already ended, that what the conference represented, allied nations assuming a shared future, had quietly expired, and that the people in that room were just now beginning to reckon with the wreckage. The official title of this year's Munich Security Report? Under Destruction. The 80-year-old US-led international order, it said, is now under destruction. Not pressure, not strain, destruction. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Both the American Secretary of State and the German Chancellor, allies, partners, the twin pillars of the Western alliance, stood at that podium and agreed on exactly one thing. The old world is gone. The post-Cold War era is over. It just ended. The only question is what comes next. And right now, nobody has a clean answer. Let me give you the sequence because it happened fast, and the individual pieces don't capture what they look like together. On February 6th, 2026, 12 days ago, NATO published a quiet but seismic announcement. The alliance agreed on a new distribution of command responsibility. From now on, all three of NATO's four-star Joint Force Commands, the operational commands that lead the alliance in actual crisis and conflict, will be led by Europeans. The UK takes Joint Force Command Norfolk. Italy takes Joint Force Command Naples. Germany and Poland will share command of Joint Force Command Brunssum on a rotating basis. Both Norfolk and Naples were previously led by the United States. Read that again. The United States, which has led the NATO command structure since the alliance was founded in 1949, has handed over operational warfighting commands to European officers, for the first time in the history of the alliance. Then, 6 days later, on February 12th, NATO defense ministers gathered in Brussels for a critical meeting, and the American Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, didn't show up. Not because of illness, not because of a scheduling conflict. He simply sent his deputy, Elbridge Colby, in his place. The second consecutive top-level NATO meeting at which the U.S. was represented by a substitute rather than a principal. Rubio had skipped the December NATO foreign ministers meeting. Hegseth skipped Brussels. One European official, asked about the absence, quipped that Hegseth was sadly missing a good party. But the laughter in the room didn't quite reach the eyes. 3 days after that, in Munich, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz walked to the podium and said the words that no German chancellor has said at that forum in over 70 years. A divide has opened up between Europe and the United States. The international order no longer exists in its original form. Then he disclosed something that would have been unthinkable even 18 months ago. He had begun talks with French President Emmanuel Macron about the creation of a European nuclear deterrent. Germany, the country that swore off nuclear weapons after 1945, the country whose post-war identity was built on never again being a military power capable of threatening its neighbors. That Germany is now in conversations about anchoring its security to a European nuclear umbrella. That should tell you everything about how much has shifted. Let me build the context because the speed of what's happening is obscuring how structural the change is. For nearly 80 years, the architecture of Western security rested on a deceptively simple arrangement. The United States provided the nuclear umbrella, the dominant military capability, the intelligence infrastructure, and the command leadership. European allies contributed forces, hosted bases, and paid, never quite enough by Washington's calculation, but enough to keep the machine running. The implicit deal was that America led and Europe followed, and in exchange, Europe got a security guarantee that made 2 world wars feel safely in the rearview mirror. That arrangement was fraying well before the current administration, But what has happened in the past 14 months has accelerated the deterioration into something that now looks less like a strained partnership and more like a managed divorce. The American National Defense Strategy, published in January 2026, made the shift explicit in language that Pentagon analysts called a stark turn toward declaratory realism. The document ranked threats in a hierarchy that put defending the U.S. homeland and deterring China at the top. Europe was secondary. The strategy ended what one European analyst at the Chatham House think tank called the era of automatic American primacy. Europe, the document implied, is rich and capable, and therefore accountable for its own conventional defense. The security guarantee still exists on paper, but America is no longer underwriting it by default. The practical consequences of that shift are already visible. U.S. supply of weapons to Ukraine, the critical test case of whether the Western alliance would hold against Russian aggression, has effectively dried up under the current administration. The Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the mechanism that coordinated Allied military support for Kyiv, was championed by the Pentagon under the previous administration. It is now chaired by the UK and Germany. America stepped back, and European allies stepped into the gap, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. At Munich, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said it plainly. It is Ukrainians who are holding the European front. Now here's the layer that changes the picture from alliance in trouble to world order restructuring. Because what's happening isn't just about NATO. It's about the entire framework of international relations that was built after 1945. The rules, the institutions, the norms that governed how countries behaved toward each other. And that framework is being dismantled from multiple directions simultaneously. The last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, New START, expired on February 5, 2026. Gone. No replacement. No negotiations in progress. The U.S. simultaneously accused China of conducting a secret underground nuclear test in 2020, a revelation held classified for years and released the day after New START expired. The timing was deliberate. The message was unmistakable. The old guardrails are off, and Washington is reserving the right to expand its arsenal. China's nuclear warhead count has passed 600 and is projected to exceed 1,000 by 2030, according to Pentagon estimates. Iran's supreme leader authorized the development of miniaturized nuclear warheads for ballistic missiles in October 2025. Russia is running joint naval exercises with China and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, while simultaneously negotiating a ceasefire in Ukraine it may or may not honor. North Korea has been feeding ballistic missile technology to multiple actors across multiple continents. The rules-based international order that the Munich Security Conference was designed to uphold, the order built on the assumption that great powers would be deterred by institutions, norms, and shared economic interest. That order is not under pressure. According to the people who spent 3 days last week examining it in detail, it is under destruction. And the people who destroyed it aren't all adversaries. Some of them are allies. That's the part that changes the calculation in ways nobody has fully processed yet. Is this landing the way it should? Because I find that when you put all of this in sequence, the command transfers, the absent defense ministers, the nuclear talks with Macron, the expired arms treaties, it hits differently than any individual headline. Let me know what you're connecting in the comments. So what does Europe actually do now? Because rhetoric is one thing. Here's what's actually happening, in concrete terms, in the past 30 days alone. Germany is building the largest military brigade it has stationed outside its own territory since World War II. It is in Lithuania, on Russia's doorstep. Germany, which has spent decades treating its post-war identity as a bulwark against military adventurism, is now forward deploying combat forces at a scale not seen since 1945. France and Germany are in active discussions, for the first time ever, about extending France's nuclear deterrent to cover European allies who might no longer be able to rely on the American umbrella. Macron has said Europe must become a geopolitical power. This is not a rhetorical flourish. France's nuclear arsenal exists. The missiles exist. What has not existed until now is a European political will to use it as collective deterrence rather than national protection. That wall is crumbling. The Netherlands is publicly calling for a European version of Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing arrangement currently linking the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The idea is to build an EU-level intelligence network that doesn't depend on American data or American goodwill. The EU's €150 billion safe defense financing program is oversubscribed. Every nation that can access it is competing for allocation. And critically, the program's procurement rules require 65% European content, by design excluding American defense contractors who have dominated Allied spending for generations. The money is flowing. It is flowing into Rheinmetall, KNDS, Saab, Leonardo, and Thales, not into Lockheed and Raytheon. By 2030, EU rules will require 55% of all alliance weapons purchases to come from European or Ukrainian manufacturers. Germany's military procurement data already shows only 8% of its 2026 purchases going to American suppliers, down from a much higher baseline just 2 years ago. The trend line is not ambiguous. This is the physical, industrial, institutional architecture of a new security order being assembled in real time. It is not a response to a future threat. It is a response to the present reality that the previous order's guarantor has decided it has other priorities. But let's not pretend this is clean, because the people doing this building are working against a clock, and the clock is running faster than they planned. Europe collectively has roughly 1.4 million active-duty military personnel. That sounds formidable, but interoperability between those forces is limited in ways that matter enormously in a real conflict. Separate communication systems, different ammunition standards, incompatible logistics chains, language barriers at the command level. Building genuine operational military integration from 27 different nations' armed forces is a task that takes a decade under good conditions. Europe does not have a decade of good conditions in front of it. The Soufan Center, one of the more rigorous security analysis organizations, put it simply in a January report. The timelines European officials have set to substitute most U.S. capabilities are colliding with a rapidly shifting international order. Europe is hedging against an increasingly unreliable transatlantic relationship, while simultaneously still depending on that relationship to survive the transition period. The nuclear question makes this even sharper. France has never been willing to place its deterrent under joint command. That was a Gaullist principle from 1966, and it has never changed. What Merz and Macron are now discussing is some form of extended deterrence that is less than full integration, but more than the current arrangement where France's missiles protect France. What that looks like in practice, what France gets, what Germany commits to, how Poland and the Baltic states factor in, nobody has worked that out. The conversations are weeks old, and Russia is watching all of this with full awareness that Europe's window of vulnerability, the gap between the old American guarantee and the new European capacity, is real and could be measured in years. Here's the bigger frame I want to leave you with, because I think the way most people are reading this is too small. The post-World War II order wasn't just a security arrangement. It was a theory about how to organize human civilization so that great power competition didn't produce mass atrocities at industrial scale. The theory was that trade integration, multilateral institutions, shared norms, and a credible security guarantor could produce sustained peace among nations that had previously destroyed themselves in war every generation. For 80 years, with significant imperfections and failures along the edges, it worked. What's replacing it isn't another theory. What's replacing it, so far, is the absence of a theory. The Munich Security Report called it deals-based rather than rules-based. Instead of universal norms, ad hoc bargains. Instead of multilateral institutions, bilateral transactions. Instead of alliances founded on principle, coalitions assembled for specific interests and dissolved when those interests shift. That's not necessarily a description of collapse. The old order had enormous failures. It failed consistently in the Global South, in conflicts that never made it onto the Munich agenda, in the asymmetry between who the rules protected and who they ignored. The world that's emerging could, in theory, distribute power more evenly, force more actors to take responsibility for their own security, and produce a more multipolar equilibrium. Or it could produce something that looks more like the 1930s, where a vacuum of leadership, a breakdown of institutions, and a multiplication of unresolved conflicts interact with each other in ways that are nonlinear and catastrophic. The people who were in Munich last week, the ones asking whether it would be the last one, are not sure which of those futures they are building toward. That uncertainty, more than any specific threat or specific policy decision, is what makes this moment genuinely different from anything in the past 8 decades. The US and Europe both agree the old world is gone. What neither of them has is a map for the new one. So here's what I want to put to you directly. The era of automatic peace underwritten by American power is ending. That's not a prediction. It's what the American Defense Secretary, the German Chancellor, the French President, and the architects of the Munich Security Report all said in public last week. What they don't agree on is what comes next, who builds it, or how long the transition takes. The honest question, the one I keep turning over and don't have a clean answer to, is whether the European project of strategic autonomy can actually happen fast enough to fill the gap before something in that gap ignites. The timeline is compressed, the vulnerabilities are real, and the actors with the most to gain from instability, Russia, China, Iran, are watching the construction process very carefully for the moment the scaffolding wobbles. Where do you think this goes? Not what you hope. What do you actually think happens over the next 5 years as this transition plays out? That's the question worth having in the comments, and I think the answer says a lot about how you read the past 8 decades and what they were really built on.